9,800. The 9,863rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation concerning the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Angola, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Malawi to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome Her Excellency Ms. Therese Kayikwamba-Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation, and Francophonie of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Bintou Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary-General and Head of the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Mr. Huang Xia, Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for the Great Lakes region. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Bintou Keita.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Therese Kayikwamba-Wagner, the Permanent Representative of the Republic of Rwanda, Ernest Ramucho, the Permanent Representative of the Republic of Angola, dear colleagues, Huang Xia, Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for the Great Lakes region, and all other ambassadors that are joining us for this session. Thank you for having convened another emergency meeting of the Council relating to the recent developments in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the need to find a way out of a crisis which represents a clear threat to the peace and stability of the Great Lakes region. This session is taking place in a context marked inter alia by the appointment of a new president of the African Union at the summit on the 15th of February. I would like to congratulate His Excellency, the President of Angola, João Lourenço, mediator of the African Union in the framework of the Luanda process. I hope that his mandate will be marked by the silencing of the guns on the continent once and for all. Despite many international calls for a ceasefire and a cessation of offensives, the M23, supported by the Rwandan army, has continued to make progress in the provinces of North Kivu and South Kivu. This advance has had devastating consequences, leading to the loss of many human lives during the taking of Goma. In 2 weeks, the Congo River Alliance, of which the M23 is one of the main components, has established a parallel administration in Goma with the designation of a governor and a mayor. In South Kivu, the M23 has taken control of Kavumu Airport and Bukavu, the provincial capital, on the 16th of February. The M23 has since then continued its advance and yesterday seized the town of Kamanyola, which is at the intersection of the three borders between the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. Since the taking of Goma, the M23 has been imposing severe restrictions on MONUSCO's freedom of movement, preventing efforts aimed at evaluating damage done to Goma Airport and efforts to support the safe elimination of unexploded ordnance in the city. The M23 has also prevented MONUSCO from resupplying with water and other vital goods the troops of the Southern African Development Community mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, SAMI DRC. What's more, the M23 is in control of all roads entering and leaving the area under its control. That poses serious challenges to the civilian and uniformed personnel of MONUSCO for rotations which are essential for the implementation of its mandate, the priority of which is the protection of the civilian population. What's more, MONUSCO's essential infrastructure in Goma and in other parts of North Kivu is under extreme pressure. These facilities are sheltering persons that sought refuge there in order to enjoy the mission's protection in accordance with international humanitarian law. However, these facilities were never designed nor equipped to house a large number of people in the long term. The situation is particularly critical because health and hygiene conditions are rapidly deteriorating, presenting a risk both to the protected persons and the personnel of MONUSCO. This is feeding disinformation and is being used to amplify anti-MONUSCO sentiments. Mr. President, the human rights situation in North and South Kivu has considerably worsened. In addition to cases of deaths due to fighting between the M23 and the security forces of the DRC, MONUSCO has also documented cases of forced recruitment. We are still observing ongoing movements of displaced persons around Goma. The majority of the former sites have been dismantled and pillaged by host communities and displaced persons, and those persons are going either to their places of origin or to new collective centres around Goma. Even though there are still uncertainties over the exact circumstances of these secondary displacements, the conditions for a safe, voluntary, informed and dignified return in line with international principles may not be guaranteed. What's more, we have recorded many searches of hospitals and homes by the M23 looking for soldiers and civilians perceived to be opposed to the group. The United Nations Joint Human Rights Office receives on a daily basis requests for individual protection from various social actors, including human rights defenders. The latter are often faced with threats, and there are risks of reprisals by M23 in areas under its control.
President, the M23's offensive in North Kivu and South Kivu has increased the vulnerability of girls and women to conflict-related sexual violence. Mass displacement, the influx of combatants and prisoners, and the proliferation of weapons have considerably exacerbated the risk. At the same time, logistical and security constraints continue to hamper the United Nations' ability to verify reported cases. In South Kivu, fighting in the Haut Plateau caused a high number of injured. Medical supplies need to be transported to Ivira to be able to assist the wounded. The situation is calm in Bukavu, where humanitarian actors are resuming their activities. Humanitarian response continues in Idjwi, where over 100,000 displaced people arrived in January, as well as in Minova, where around 200,000 displaced people are staying with host families. Humanitarian actors must continue to have access and be able to do their work unhindered to keep assisting this vulnerable population. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I welcome the conclusions of the joint summit of the East African Community and the Southern African Development Community on the situation in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo on the 8th of February in Tanzania. This summit reaffirmed the call for a cessation of hostilities and an immediate ceasefire. The summit also insisted on the resumption of direct negotiations and dialogue with all state and non-state parties, including M23, in the context of the Luanda and Nairobi processes. It also reaffirmed the call for the neutralization of the FDLR and the withdrawal of Rwandan troops from Congolese soil. It is essential that the provisions of the communiqué from the EAC SADC summit relating to the restoration of essential public services, the immediate reopening of Goma Airport, and the primary supply routes, including over Lake Kivu, be implemented immediately in order to alleviate the suffering of the population. I encourage the heads of the military staff of EAC and SADC countries to meet on a constant basis to determine modalities for the implementation of the ceasefire, as well as urgent measures provided for in the communiqué. In addition to the reopening of the Goma Airport requested by the summit, the reopening of Kavumu Airport would also be essential. The United Nations, including MONUSCO, remains determined to support all efforts to bring the parties to the negotiating table in order to find lasting political solutions to this crisis, which risks engulfing the entire region. In this regard, it is important to recall the significant progress made in recent months in the context of the Luanda process. It is crucial, as underscored in the communiqué from the African Union Peace and Security Council meeting in Addis Ababa on the 14th of February, that what has been achieved not be lost.
It is imperative that this Council takes urgent and decisive steps to avert a wider regional war. I call on this Council to hold the perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses in the Democratic Republic of Congo accountable. In this regard, I welcome the adoption by the Human Rights Council on 7th February of a resolution establishing a fact-finding mission to be followed by an independent commission of inquiry to investigate and document violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in the Eastern DRC. Finally, I call on all parties to uphold their obligations to protect civilians in full compliance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This includes the inviolability of United Nations premises and installations in the Democratic Republic of Congo, including the safety and security of individuals under MONUSCO's protection. Thank you for your kind attention.
I thank Ms. Keita for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Huang Xia. Mr. President, members of the Council, I would like to thank you for this invitation to give a briefing on the developments in the situation of Eastern DRC and also to share with you some information about the regional situation. The dire situation now urgently requires parties to pay close attention together and immediately take concerted action to respond.
At the end of January, we witnessed history repeating itself worryingly when M23, supported by the Rwandan Defense Forces, once again stormed the city of Goma. Today, after only 3 weeks, M23 now controls Bukavu, and if our information is correct, they continue to advance towards other strategic areas in North and South Kivu. At this stage, we are not aware of the intricacies of the M23 agenda and do not really know the intention of their backers. Neither do we know how far they will go or why, but what we do know, in the light of developments in recent weeks and in view of acts on the ground as well as public statements made by stakeholders in the region, is that the risk of a regional conflagration is more real today than ever before. This situation must stop before we see the triggering of a widespread regional war, the consequences of which would be devastating from several points of view. Consequently, we must all step up our efforts to avoid undoing all and undermining, indeed, all efforts made over the last decade, aiming to achieve stability, cooperation, and the integration of countries in the Great Lakes region. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, I hail the countries and organizations in the region who have rallied to quickly respond to the crises. They've done that, namely, by convening various summits. The summits of the EAC summit, the summit of the EAC, rather, the SADC summit, the Heads of States Conference of the Central African Community, and there was also the Heads of State Summit on the Humanitarian Situation held in Malabo, along with the joint EAC SADC Summit. All of these summits unanimously underscored the crucial importance of respecting the territorial integrity of the DRC. They roundly condemned the M23 offensive and also as well as the support afforded to that group. At the same time, the summits emphasized the need to rapidly find a political and diplomatic solution to the crisis. In this connection, the joint EAC SADC summit marks a key step in terms of the emergence of a regional approach which is finally coordinated, concerted and unified in nature. It is laying down the cornerstones for a consensus-based resolution to the crisis in Eastern DRC. The joint summit emphasized the need for a political solution, calling for the resumption of direct negotiations and dialogue with all stakeholders. The joint summit also called for the merging of the Nairobi and Luanda processes with a view to bolstering coordination and ensuring complementary work, as well as the creation of a coordination mechanism at a secretariat level. Moreover, the African Union Peace and Security Council met at heads of state level on the 14th of February. It enshrined the decisions reached at the joint EAC SADC summit. At the same time, it recalled the need to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC and condemned the activities of both the M23 and its backers. The Peace and Security Council also called for coordination to be strengthened, as well as for technical support and for the implementation of financing mechanisms in order to buttress peace efforts. It's now important that we see the expeditious and effective implementation of the outcomes of all of these summits. I am delighted to here note that the preparations for the Chiefs of Staff meeting of EAC and SADC are underway, and that the meeting could be held in the coming days. Elsewhere, the secretariats of these two regional organizations, as well as the AU Commission, have guaranteed that they will follow up on the decision to implement a joint technical coordination mechanism. Consultations are also underway between member states concerned in order to establish the modalities which will see the merging of the Nairobi and Luanda processes. These include namely the possible appointment of additional facilitators to bolster both coordination and coherence. I should take this opportunity to call for women to be duly included in these mediation mechanisms in accordance with common commitments entered into regarding women's participation. Moreover, I here wish to commend the role played by Congolese civil society stakeholders, particularly that played by religious leaders. They have spared no effort in recent weeks to consult all relevant stakeholders with a view to bringing them back to the negotiation table. All of these processes are encouraging. However, they must be supported and followed up by regional action. As far as I'm concerned, I have undertaken consultations with all stakeholders involved in order to encourage coordination and the speedy implementation of provisions agreed upon. These provisions are crucial if we are to ultimately achieve the de-escalation of the situation on the ground. They're also vital in order to support humanitarian aid, the protection of women and girls that have been victims of violence, and in order to guarantee the resumption of a dialogue which involves all relevant actors in accordance with decisions taken by heads of state. In the next few days, I will continue to engage with regional stakeholders to encourage them in their efforts and to reiterate that the United Nations stands ready to extend to them political and technical support. President, distinguished members of the Council, as catastrophic as the situation may appear today, it can, grow worse. 12 years after the signing of the Framework Agreement and 19 years after the signing of the Pact of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, history is repeating itself, unfortunately. We must take action now. We must act quickly, collectively, and in a decisive fashion. As we were reminded by our Secretary General, we must quickly guarantee the implementation of these following three immediate priorities. 1. De-escalation via an immediate ceasefire and through all parties' compliance with international law and their upholding of commitments entered into as part of regional and international mechanisms, including the Addis Ababa Framework Agreement. The latter indeed demands that no one tolerate or supply either assistance or any support whatsoever to armed groups. It also calls upon all parties to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of neighbouring states. The cessation of hostilities is a matter of urgency if we are to address the devastating humanitarian consequences of the conflict, as well as the consequences for human rights, if we are to lay the necessary foundations for a constructive dialogue. The second priority is the resumption of dialogue. We will never hammer this home enough. The solution to be found is a political one and not a military one. Dialogue and compromise are necessary to find a lasting solution. As such, I here urge all parties to return to the table and to draw upon provisions already agreed upon by the parties within the Luanda and Nairobi processes, or within any other processes which may arise. This in accordance with decisions taken by heads of state in the region. I urge all parties to engage in good faith in these peace efforts and to support them because they are essential in order to resolve the crisis and avoid a regional war. Let us work together to restore the ceasefire, to restore the territorial integrity of the DRC, and to definitively resolve the issue of the FDLR and that of M23 in order to ultimately heed the security concerns of all parties. I do not think that these two areas of focus are irreconcilable. It is today time to once again gather around the negotiating table and to candidly discuss the root causes of this conflict. The third priority, a holistic regional approach, is necessary to deal with the root causes of the conflict to which I previously referred. The region must prioritize a holistic approach which combines immediate action and also medium and long-term endeavors. Against that backdrop, it is important to continue and conclude the process seeking to revitalize the Addis Ababa Framework Agreement. That is a crucial tool. It's also vital to tackle once and for all the root causes of instability in the Great Lakes region. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate my appeal for the urgent convening of the next high-level meeting of the Regional Oversight Mechanism. During that meeting, heads of state of the countries concerned will be called upon not only to express their unanimous support for peace efforts in order to put an end to the current crisis. They will also, however, be called upon to deliver their verdict on recommendations aiming to revitalize the framework agreement so that it can be comprehensively and genuinely implemented. Mr. President, allow me to conclude by issuing a direct appeal to the members of this Council. They too must use the full weight of their power in order to attempt to end the crisis. Robust and united action on the part of this Council is indeed paramount to avoid passing the point of no return and to convince the parties to return to dialogue, to restore peace and security in the Great Lakes region. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Xia for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General and the Special Envoy for the Great Lakes for their briefings. I welcome the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Security Council is meeting once again due to the continued deterioration of the situation in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. After Goma 3 weeks ago, the M23 has taken Kavumu Airport and Bukavu on Saturday and is continuing its offensive in South Kivu. The risk of a regional war is increasing each day. France condemns the M23 offensive that is permitted through the active support of Rwanda. The current fighting is worsening a dramatic humanitarian situation marked by the forced displacement of 1 million people. This fighting goes hand in hand with attacks on civilians, in particular sexual violence and violence against children. The United Nations have recorded 2,900 deaths during the first week of the offensive. The UNOHCHR yesterday confirmed cases of the summary execution of children by M23 in Bukavu. This must therefore end immediately. The M23 must end its offensive and withdraw from the territory of which it has taken control. Support for armed groups by all parties must end. The Rwandan Defense Forces must immediately withdraw from the territory of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. France also condemns the attacks of the M23 against MONUSCO, obstacles to the exercise of its mandate, and destabilizing actions conducted against it. The freedom of movement and of action of MONUSCO must be guaranteed. Attacks against blue helmets, as well as civilians and humanitarian personnel, may constitute war crimes. France reaffirms its full support for MONUSCO. There is no military solution to the conflict. The priority is a ceasefire that is...
Prise du dialogue. La France salue la mobilisation régionale lors du dernier sommet du Conseil de paix et de sécurité de l'Union africaine, ainsi que du sommet conjoint de la communauté d'Afrique de l'Est et de la communauté de développement d'Afrique australe. Elle soutient ces efforts et souligne le rôle clé des processus régionaux de médiation. Les acquis du processus de Luanda demeurent essentiels pour avancer vers un règlement qui passe par le retrait des troupes rwandaises du territoire congolais et le démantèlement des forces démocratiques de libération du Rwanda. La France appelle l'ensemble des groupes armés, dont le M23, à déposer les armes et à reprendre le dialogue. Le Conseil de sécurité doit apporter une réponse à la hauteur de la situation pour mettre fin aux hostilités, réaffirmer un soutien ferme à l'intégrité territoriale et la souveraineté congolaise, appuyer les efforts de la MONUSCO et créer les conditions favorables au dialogue. La France a proposé il y a déjà 2 semaines un projet de résolution en ce sens. Nous espérons que l'esprit de responsabilité des membres de ce Conseil permettra d'adopter cette résolution dans les meilleurs délais. Je vous remercie.
我感谢法国代表的发言，下面我请索马里代表发言。
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of A3, Algeria, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Somalia. We would like to thank the SRSG, Madame Bintou Keita, and Special Envoy Secretary General, Mr. Huang Sha, for their insightful briefings on the current situation in Eastern DRC. We salute the dedication and the services of MONUSCO, particularly the peacekeepers and all other operational personnel who continue to tirelessly support the Congolese people. We also acknowledge the crucial contribution of Symmetric personnel and welcome the participation of Her Excellence Teresa Kayakwamba Wagner, the State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and the Francophone of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We also welcome the representatives of Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa in this meeting. The A3 welcomes the convening of today's meeting, which affords the Security Council the opportunity to take stock on the recent development in the DRC since we last met to discuss the situation. At the outset, in light of the unfolding situation in the last few weeks, the A3 wishes to express its solidarity with the communities of Eastern DRC, from Masisi to Sake, Goma, and Bukavu. These communities are living in a constant fear as the M23 advances, with no clear sense of what the future holds. The resilience in the face of such uncertainty is commendable, yet their fate remains unclear. The threat of complete chaos that could degenerate into catastrophic violence is still very real, and people are not sure whether they will be able to return to their fields and grow their crops, or whether they will need to flee once again in the case of further violence. The A3 calls for calm and urges all parties to ensure that no further escalation of violence takes place in Eastern DRC. Mr. President, in light of the development on the ground right now, A3 wishes to make these 3 points. First, in addition to the continuing violence still persisting in the areas controlled by the M23, the A3 is also concerned by the continued escalation of violence in other localities, including Lubumbashi, Kisangani, and Uvira, coupled with the absence of MONUSCO and the mission's inability to operate in these areas. We therefore strongly reiterate our call for M23 to cease hostilities and stop its violence and advance and capture of more territories. We also call on M23 to lift its severe restrictions of MONUSCO's freedoms movement, preventing efforts to assess damage at Goma Airport and to assist with the safe disposal of unexploded ordnance across the city. The violence must come to an end, and M23's continued territorial expansion threats the sovereignty of the DRC and undermines the possibility of the dialogue. We cannot afford to stand and allow further losses, including the potential fall of Kisangani. This is why we firmly denounce any form of support extended to M23 or other armed groups operating in the DRC. It's time for this Council to genuinely support and facilitate the cessation of hostilities, including the withdrawal of M23 from territories under their control since the turn of the year. Second, A3 is deeply concerned that in the face of this violence, the humanitarian situation has significantly worsened. According to the figures from UN OCHA, more than 21 million people require humanitarian assistance across the DRC. The escalation of violence has worsened this crisis, particularly with the disruption of the supply routes. We therefore call for the development of securitization plan for Goma and surrounding areas and the reopening of Goma Airport, reoperationalization of the Kavumu Airport, and restoration of the key supply routes to ensure that timely delivery of humanitarian aid, as highlighted in the joint communique issued by the head of states and governments of EAC and SADC and endorsed by AU Peace and Security Communique. We therefore call for the restoration of essential utilities and supply lines for food and other essential commodities to ensure humanitarian support to those in need, and urge the parties to commit to upholding human rights law and international humanitarian law. Third, Mr. President, as this Council is aware, among the key roles of A3 is the responsibility to bring the gap between deliberations of this Council and African common position on the issue of relevance to the continent. As such, I would like to take this moment to highlight the efforts of African leadership in the broader search for a solution to the crisis of Eastern DRC, which has remained consistently high on the agenda of the African Union, the East African Community, and the Economic Community of Central Africa States and Southern Africa Development Communities. Over the last 3 years, in particular since the re-emergence of M23, African leadership has responded urgently to the crisis, first by appointing His Excellency João Lourenço, the President of Angola, as the designated mediator between DRC and Rwanda and current chairperson of the African Union, as well as putting together an initial framework of the negotiation between Congolese government and the armed groups under the Nairobi process, led by the former President of Kenya, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta. The involvement of SADC in the 2023 also signaled that an effective solution to the crisis in Congo would only be enabled by an active participation of broader regional actors, effectively showing that African conflicts need and deserve African-led and owned solutions. In this context, A3 would like to reiterate to all parties the importance of the commitment made within the framework of the Luanda process, and in this regard reiterates our call for the implementation of the concept of Operations Conopis, of the harmonization plan for the lifting of the Rwanda's defense measures and disengagement of the forces from the DRC and neutralization of the FDLR as agreed in the Luanda process. Furthermore, A3 would like to underscore the outcome of the recent meeting convened by African sub-regional and continental bodies at the head of states level, including the proposed merging of Nairobi and Luanda processes. It's our hope that the harmonization of these efforts will get the region closer to peace solutions. There is no gainsaying that the Council, as well as the international community at large, should strongly support these African initiatives. It's time for the Council to lend a real support to these African-led initiatives, act constructively to strengthen them, and to go beyond simply paying lip service. Mr. President, looking ahead, it's clear as it has been reiterated many times in this Council, that there is no military solution to this conflict, which makes it all more urgent to secure unconditional and immediate ceasefire in eastern DRC. In this regard, we call to all parties to agree to a ceasefire and to commit to putting down their weapons and creating necessary space for a negotiated political solution. The A3 echoes the call for the East African Community and SADC meeting for monitoring such ceasefire by EAC and SADC Chiefs of Defense Forces. Along similar lines, we also look forward to the resumption of peace talks as called by the EAC and SADC and endorsed by the AU Peace and Security Head of States Gathering meeting. In this regard, we look forward to the implementation of the follow-up actions to be taken up by the joint meeting of EAC and SADC ministers to address all residual issues relating to the attainment of sustainable peace and security in the eastern DRC. In conclusion, Mr. President, we have heard countless times, both within and outside the Council, the calls for lasting peace. The people of DRC need and deserve to live in their country peacefully. The territories of DRC should not be violated, and its sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected. Now, this is the time to move beyond rhetoric and to act decisively in our deliberations to find solutions that both addresses the current crisis while ultimately addressing the root causes of this conflict. The A3 stands in solidarity with the children, women, men of the DRC and underscores the full respect of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I thank you.
我感谢索马里代表所做的发言。下面我请巴基斯坦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Pakistan delegation thanks you for convening this urgent meeting of the Security Council. We thank SRSG Bindu Keita and Special Envoy Wang Sha for their briefings on the disturbing situation in eastern DRC. We welcome the participation in this meeting of the Foreign Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo and other African permanent representatives. Mr. President, both our briefers have mentioned that history is repeating itself. And we must remember the adage that those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it. In defiance of the Council's position, expressed in its press statement of 6 February, and the African mediation processes, the M23 has continued its advance. Since the Council's meeting on January 26, the M23, backed by external forces, has attacked and taken control of the city of Goma, the airports of Goma and Kavumu, and now Bukavu, the capital of South Kivu. As the Secretary General of the United Nations has stated at the AU summit last weekend, the M23 offensive, and I quote, threatens to push the entire region over the precipice. Regional escalation must be avoided at all costs, unquote. Mr. President, we condemn in the strongest words the occupation of Goma and Bukavu by M23. It must immediately accept a ceasefire, stop its advance, and withdraw from the territories it has taken over, and do so without preconditions. We reiterate our support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We call for the withdrawal of all uninvited forces, including Rwandan forces, from the territory of the DRC. A wider war must be prevented at all costs. Mr. President, we are extremely concerned about the reported violence committed against civilians in areas under the control of M23, including extrajudicial killings. These must be immediately stopped, and those responsible must be held to account. Immediate and unhindered access must be provided to humanitarian organizations to alleviate the humanitarian crises, including the repair and opening of the airports in order to fly in medical and other essential supplies. We have received information on violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in North Kivu, largely due to the presence of MONUSCO in North Kivu. However, due to its untimely withdrawal from South Kivu, we must be concerned that away from the eyes of an impartial entity, the violations of human rights in South Kivu could be much worse than in North Kivu. Mr. President, we are all agreed that there is no military solution to the crisis in eastern DRC. Pakistan respects the African regional processes to bring an end to the hostilities and to promote a resolution of this conflict. We welcome the AU communique and the EAC SADC joint communique calling for cessation of hostilities and an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. It is important that the understandings reached at the SADC-EAC summit be implemented urgently. Similarly, there is a need to carry forward the Luanda and Nairobi processes, and we note the move to merge these processes. The understandings reached under the Luanda process for the withdrawal of Rwanda Defense Forces and the neutralization of the FDLR must be both implemented. Mr. President, at the same time, it must be recognized that the Security Council has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter. It is this Council which has the authority to enforce the decisions of the international community, including those reached within the African processes. Pakistan is therefore working constructively to evolve effective Council action that enjoys the widest possible support within the Council and responds to the threat posed by the M23 offensive and the danger of a wider conflict. Mr. President, Pakistan is particularly concerned about the challenges facing MONUSCO due to the volatile security environment in and around Goma. Its overcrowded facilities, limited rations, spreading disease, as well as the restrictions that have been imposed on the movement of MONUSCO by M23. The Security Council must be unequivocal in demanding that MONUSCO be assured of freedom of movement to carry out its operational activities and to perform its mandate to protect civilians, including outside its bases. The M23 and its supporters must be told categorically that attacks on United Nations and other peacekeepers and civilians constitute war crimes for which those responsible will be held accountable. At the same time, there is need to review the present and future role of MONUSCO. It is positive that the new force commander has joined MONUSCO. We call on all TCCs and PCCs within MONUSCO to respect the chain of command and to show their commitment and solidarity with the mission in these difficult times. Close consultations are also needed to develop options for MONUSCO's future role in the DRC under the evolving scenarios for the denouement of this conflict. Mr. President, finally, we urge that the Security Council seriously address the root cause of the conflict in eastern DRC, that is, the illegal exploitation of its natural resources. This requires greater oversight and traceability mechanisms working in coordination with the DRC government and regional and international partners. Pakistan, in this context, recognizes the important role of the Special Envoy, Mr. Huang Xia, in this endeavor. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢巴基斯坦代表的发言，下面我请希腊代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank SRSG Mrs. Keita, Special Envoy Mr. Huang Xia, for briefing us on this urgent meeting today and commend the courage of all of MONUSCO's personnel in these very difficult circumstances. I would also like to welcome the participation of the Honorable Foreign Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo in our meeting. Mr. President, allow me to emphasize briefly 4 key points. First, we strongly condemn the capture of the cities of Sake, Goma, and Bukavu by the M23. We reiterate that the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the DRC must be fully respected. The presence of Rwandan troops of the territory of DRC and the support to the M23 are very concerning and are strongly condemned. We call on Rwanda to cease its support to the M23 and to immediately withdraw its forces. Second, we call for urgent de-escalation, and we stress that it is more imperative than ever that particularly Rwanda and DRC commit to the ceasefire as agreed last August, re-engage in the political dialogue, and implement all decisions and commitments agreed under the Luanda process. We encourage African-led initiatives and regional efforts, including by the African Union, the East African Community, and SADC, and we call DRC and Rwanda to return immediately to the table of negotiations. Third, we are deeply concerned about the grave humanitarian security consequences of the M23 offensive, both in North and South Kivu. All parties must respect international humanitarian law and ensure unrestricted humanitarian access. We strongly condemn all forms of human rights violations, abuses, violence against civilians, summary executions and maiming, sex and gender-based violence, recruitment and use of children. Fourth and last, we reiterate our full support to MONUSCO, which is acting within its mandate and doing critical work in the DRC, stress our strong commitment to the safety and security of its peacekeepers, and condemn the attacks committed against personnel. MONUSCO must be granted full access and freedom of movement. Its personnel must be allowed to return to Goma in order to effectively fulfill its mandate, in particular the protection of civilians and address urgent needs. The protection of civilians and of humanitarian and medical personnel must remain an absolute priority. Attacks against peacekeepers may constitute potential war crimes, and those attacks against MONUSCO peacekeepers form also a basis for potential sanctions designation. Mr. President, we stand ready to support any further engagement of this Council as necessary. I thank you.
希腊代表的发言，下面我请斯洛文尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank the briefers, Bento Keita and Huang Xia, for briefing us. And we want to welcome Foreign Minister of Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we also want to welcome representatives of the region in the chamber. Given the rapidly evolving security situation and escalating humanitarian concerns, we believe this Council meeting is critically needed. In the Eastern DRC, the situation is swiftly and visibly deteriorating into mounting peril. Civilians are caught in the eye of a violent storm. In the words of Special Envoy, there is a risk of regional conflagration, and the risk is real. Regional peace and security is in danger. Following the seizure of Goma, reports showcase a shocking death toll and thousands with life-altering injuries. The violence must stop immediately. There is no justification for the horrific stories of summary executions, including children, for widespread conflict-related sexual violence, for widespread displacement, for child recruitment, for intimidation against human rights defenders and civil society actors. We categorically condemn any targeting, threats, or attacks on humanitarian workers and denounce these actions in the strongest possible terms. It remains imperative that those responsible are held accountable. Mr. President, the gravity of this crisis extends far beyond the immediate human tragedy. The rapid offensive by M23, supported by Rwandan Defense Forces, now marking its presence in South Kivu, with the seizure of key locations such as Kavumu Airport and the city of Bukavu, poses a significant threat to the broader stability of the Great Lakes region. We demand that M23 withdraw unconditionally from all territories they have occupied. Immediate and unrestricted reopening of the airport in Goma must be ensured so that the delivery of humanitarian assistance, the rotation and resupply of UN peacekeepers and other personnel can proceed safely. Unhindered humanitarian access must be ensured without delay, with secure humanitarian corridors to reach those in need. All parties must adhere to international humanitarian and human rights law. We echo the African Union, SADC and EAC in urgently calling for an immediate halt to all hostilities and a return to diplomatic dialogue. We continue to support strong African engagement and regional diplomatic processes, notably through the merged Luanda-Nairobi process. We continue to call on DRC and Rwanda to exercise the utmost restraint, de-escalate tensions, re-engage in dialogue, address the root causes, and prioritize peace and stability for the region. We condemn any violation of the DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Unauthorized military presence in DRC is a blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter. We call on Rwanda to fully withdraw its forces immediately and to end any support for M23. We call on DRC to stop cooperating with the FDLR and other armed groups. Finally, we condemn in the strongest terms attacks, hostility, and threats against MONUSCO and its personnel. We further denounce the severe restrictions imposed by M23 on MONUSCO and their freedom of movement, which have not only impeded the implementation of their mandated tasks, but have also contributed to a compromised situation at their bases. This is unacceptable. Mr. President, in conclusion, I reiterate what we stated already during the first emergency meeting. This Council must not remain passive in the face of this crisis. We have clearly heard calls from the field and received abundance of reports. Now we must step up. Thank you.
感谢斯洛文尼亚代表的发言。下面我请美国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, SRSG Bintu Keita and Special Envoy Huang Xie, for your briefings and for your leadership. The United States extends its fullest support to MONUSCO and all UN personnel supporting peaceful and humanitarian responses to the crisis in eastern DRC. Mr. President and Council members, how many times must we meet to discuss these predictable cycles of violence? For months, we have consistently watched M23 and Rwanda ignore ceasefires, seize territory under false pretexts, and deny intention of further expansion, only to start the cycle anew. We have witnessed M23 sow chaos and wage brutal violence against civilians on the streets of Masisi, Goma, and now Bukavu, all under the disingenuous guise of liberation or restoring order. The United States strongly condemns the seizure of Kavumu Airport and the city of Bukavu by M23 and Rwandan forces. We continue to stand in full support of the Congolese people and of their country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Once again, we urge M23 to immediately cease its offensive and withdraw from all territories of which it has taken control. We urge Rwanda to cease supporting M23, immediately withdraw its forces from the DRC, and hold accountable those who perpetrate human rights abuses and violations. We now have confirmed reports from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights of summary executions of children at the hands of M23 in Bukavu, among other serious human rights abuses. We condemn these abuses, for which there cannot be continued impunity. We watched with concern Monday's demonstrations at MONUSCO's bases in Goma, and we remain alarmed by reliable reports that M23, with Rwandan support, are orchestrating these protests, which have killed peacekeepers and civilians in the past. We condemn these and all actions that harm UN peacekeepers and undermine MONUSCO's civilian protection mandate, which is so instrumental at this moment in eastern DRC. M23 must immediately cease its hostile threats against MONUSCO, reopen the Goma airport, and ensure the UN's full freedom. M23 must immediately cease its hostile threats against MONUSCO, reopen the Goma airport, and ensure the UN's full freedom of movement, particularly at border crossings. In light of Rwanda's support for
the violence must come to an end, and M23's continued territorial expansion threats the sovereignty of the DRC and undermines the possibility of the dialogue. We cannot afford to stand and allow further losses, including the potential fall of Kisangani. Must come to an end, and M23's continued territorial expansion threats the sovereignty of the DRC and undermines the possibility of the dialogue.
SRSG Bindu Keita and Special Envoy Huang Xia.
Special Envoy Mr. Huang Xia for briefing us on this urgent meeting today
for the region. We condemn any violation of the DRC's sovereignty and territorial
in the past. We condemn these and all actions that harm UN peacekeepers and undermine MONUSCO's civilian protection mandate, which is so instrumental at this moment in eastern DRC. M23 must immediately cease its hostile threats against MONUSCO, reopen the Goma airport, and ensure the UN's full freedom of movement, particularly at border crossings. In light of Rwanda's support for M23's hostility against MONUSCO, we reiterate that the UN should immediately engage the Rwandan government at the highest levels to underscore the importance of peacekeeper safety and security. Without a change in Rwanda's behavior, the UN should reevaluate Rwanda's ability to participate constructively in UN peacekeeping. We call for protection and free movement of civilians seeking safety, and for all parties to uphold international humanitarian principles, stop attacks on civilian infrastructure, and guarantee unhindered humanitarian access. M23's and Rwanda's actions have also created space for other armed groups to expand their own violent assaults on Congolese civilians. We condemn the latest horrific attacks carried out by Codeco, and we applaud MONUSCO's quick response to defend the population against further violence. This conflict has also exacerbated exploitation and trafficking in eastern DRC's mineral sector, with widespread evidence that 3T minerals are being smuggled to enter international supply chains, including through neighboring countries. We urge an immediate cessation of sourcing of minerals from areas controlled by M23, particularly those identified as red zones by the DRC government. It is beyond time for this Council, the UN, and the international community to marshal a strong and unambiguous response to M23 and Rwandan actions which undermine prospects for peace and bring the region closer to the brink of an all-out war. We fully support the call by the AU Peace and Security Council for an immediate resumption of negotiations and dialogue with all state and non-state parties, both military and non-military, including the M23, under the frameworks of the Luanda and Nairobi processes. Intense and sustained pressure is needed now to compel Rwanda to return to the negotiations under the Angola-led Luanda process and to work in good faith toward a diplomatic resolution to the conflict in eastern DRC. The United States is prepared to work with Council members on sanctions nominations in the 1533 Committee, and we urge Council members to take urgent action. Furthermore, we remain prepared to leverage all the tools at our disposal in order to hold accountable those responsible for sustaining armed conflict, instability, and insecurity in the DRC. I thank you.
感谢美国代表的发言。下面我请圭亚那代表发言。
Mr. President, Guyana welcomes the urgent convening of this meeting, given the recent developments in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, particularly in Bukavu. I thank SRSG Keita and Special Envoy Shea for their briefings. I welcome the participation of Her Excellency Ms. Therese Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie of the DRC, and also the permanent representatives of several other African countries in this meeting. Mr. President, Guyana aligns with the statement delivered on behalf of A3 and wishes to further elucidate in our national capacity. We are alarmed by the recent developments in eastern DRC, with the M23 expanding its territorial gains by more than 30% since 15 January, and with that, its violent attacks against innocent civilians. The reports emanating from the United Nations about increased human rights violations and abuse are extremely concerning and demand a swift response from the international community, including the Security Council. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has confirmed cases of summary execution of children by the M23 after they entered the city of Bukavu last week. The office has also documented cases of ill treatment, conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, child and forced recruitment, intimidation, and death threats. Guyana condemns these violations by the M23, reportedly with the support of the Rwandan Defense Force, and calls for an immediate ceasefire and for the group to withdraw to the pre-cantonment areas. We also call on Rwanda to cease its support to the M23 and to withdraw its forces from the territory of the DRC immediately and unconditionally. We stress that it is unacceptable for foreign military forces of any country to enter the territory of another without authorization, and call for full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC. Moreover, we call on the government of the DRC to sever its ties with the FDLR and to implement its commitment to neutralize this group. Mr. President, as with any conflict situation, it is always the innocent civilians that bear the brunt. In this regard, we urge the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, allowing for unhindered access to essential services and delivery of humanitarian aid. We call on all parties to uphold and fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, including by ensuring the protection of civilians and the delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need. We also reject the severe restrictions being imposed upon MONUSCO's freedom of movement, preventing efforts to assess the damage at the Goma airport, and to assist with the safe disposal of unexploded ordnance across the city. MONUSCO must be allowed to implement its mandate without restrictions. We further emphasize that attacks against peacekeepers may constitute a war crime and call for all hostilities against peacekeepers to cease. Guyana extends its full support to MONUSCO in the implementation of its mandate and insists on full accountability for any attack against MONUSCO personnel. Mr. President, the ongoing offensive in North Kivu and South Kivu poses a significant threat to peace and security of the Great Lakes region and risks a wider regional conflagration. We must ensure that this does not happen. For this reason, Guyana supports the initiative for this Council to speak with one voice and send a clear message to the parties. As we continue our deliberations on the draft resolution under consideration, we urge fellow Council members to focus on the bigger picture, to support the regional efforts, to not only address the current crisis, but more importantly, its root causes, and to find a lasting solution. We also encourage the international community to work together to de-escalate rather than fuel tensions. There is no military solution, as was said before, to this crisis, and now is certainly not the time for soundbite diplomacy. Any action that pulls states away from dialogue condemns their entire populations into cycles of conflict and violence, and it is always the innocent civilians that suffer. The path to a lasting solution will only be found through dialogue, diplomacy, and the rule of law. In this regard, Guyana fully supports the regional mediation efforts, including the Luanda and Nairobi processes, and welcomes the ongoing efforts of the African Union, the East African Community, and the Southern African Development Community in responding to the crisis. We also welcome the communiqué adopted by the AU Peace and Security Council following their summit meeting of 14 February, which endorsed the decisions of the EAC, SADC, and joint EAC-SADC meetings, and encouraged the international community to support their implementation. More importantly, we urge Rwanda and the DRC to return to dialogue and diplomacy, to fully implement their commitments under the regional processes, and to engage in good faith with each other to reach a peaceful and sustainable solution. In conclusion, Mr. President, Guyana reaffirms its support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC and for all efforts that will bring peace to the region. I thank you.
我感谢圭亚那代表的发言。下面我请巴拿马代表发言。
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos el informe de la representante especial del secretario general y jefa de la MONUSCO, Bintou Keita, así como del enviado especial del secretario general para la región de los Grandes Lagos de África, Huang Xia, cuyo liderazgo es fundamental en estos momentos críticos para la estabilidad de la República Democrática del Congo y de toda la región. Reconocemos la participación de la distinguida ministra de Relaciones Exteriores de la República Democrática de Congo, así como de los representantes de los países de la región que nos distinguen con su participación. La República de Panamá expresa su profunda preocupación ante la alarmante escalada de violencia en el este de la República Democrática del Congo. En las últimas semanas, el grupo rebelde M23 ha intensificado sus operaciones militares, logrando con violencia el control de ciudades estratégicas como Goma, su aeropuerto y más recientemente Bukavu. Estas acciones han provocado la pérdida de miles de vidas y el desplazamiento forzado de cientos de miles de personas, agravando aún más una crisis humanitaria de por sí devastadora. Nos alarma además el recrudecimiento de las tensiones entre la República Democrática de Congo y Ruanda, cuya relación se encuentra en un punto crítico tras el reciente intercambio de acusaciones sobre incursiones transfronterizas y el apoyo a grupos armados. En este sentido, Instamos a todos los estados de la región a ejercer la máxima contención y a reafirmar su compromiso con los mecanismos diplomáticos existentes, en particular con el proceso de Luanda y el proceso de Nairobi, cuyo cumplimiento efectivo es esencial para la reducción de tensiones y el establecimiento de una paz duradera. Señor Presidente, la violencia desatada por actores armados no solo impacta a la población civil, sino que también representa un grave desafío para la MONUSCO, que enfrenta crecientes amenazas y restricciones a sus operaciones. Asimismo, reiteramos nuestro rechazo a cualquier forma de violencia que atente contra la seguridad e integridad física de la población civil y hacemos un llamado urgente a reforzar la protección de los cascos azules. De igual manera, respaldamos el llamado de las entidades de las Naciones Unidas para la implementación de pausas humanitarias temporales en zonas críticas, así como para el establecimiento de corredores humanitarios seguros y eficaces que garanticen el acceso a la asistencia vital. Por otro lado, Panamá condena enérgicamente las graves violaciones de derechos humanos, incluidas la violencia sexual como arma de guerra y el reclutamiento forzado de niños y niñas por parte de grupos armados. Estas atrocidades no pueden quedar impunes. Exhortamos al Consejo de Seguridad a fortalecer el régimen de sanciones contra quienes perpetúan la violencia y a garantizar que los responsables rindan cuentas ante la justicia internacional. Para finalizar, reafirmamos nuestra firme e inquebrantable compromiso con la soberanía e integridad territorial de la República Democrática del Congo. Exhortamos en particular al M23 a cesar sus avances y a retirarse por completo y de inmediato en estricto cumplimiento del alto al fuego y el respeto absoluto a los procesos de mediación en curso. A la vez, por las mismas razones, exhortamos a Ruanda a detener su apoyo al M23, a ejercer sus mejores oficios para desescalar este conflicto y a retirar sus fuerzas armadas del territorio de la República Democrática del Congo a la mayor brevedad posible. Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank SRSG Keita for informing us of the current situation on the ground, and Special Envoy Xia for his briefing on regional peace efforts. I welcome the presence of Her Excellency Foreign Minister Wagner at this meeting, as well as all the representatives from the region. Mr. President, Denmark strongly condemns the ongoing offensive by the M23, backed by the RDF, as well as the recent capture of Kavumu airport and the city of Bukavu. The offensive has resulted in immense suffering and risks plunging the region into an even deeper and wider conflict. There can be no military solution, only a political one. What is urgently needed is the resumption of dialogue with all state and non-state actors, including the M23, within the framework of the Luanda and Nairobi processes, respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law, and the full respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the DRC. We call on Rwanda to immediately withdraw its forces from DRC territory and to cease its support to the M23. The M23 must immediately halt and reverse its ongoing offensive and withdraw from the territories it has taken control of. We call on the DRC to cease its support to the FDLR. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 points. First, what we are witnessing in North and South Kivu is nothing short of a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are urgently seeking protection from violence, persecution, rape, disease, and death. Humanitarians have been attacked and killed, humanitarian warehouses and facilities have been looted, access and supply routes have been obstructed, and civilian infrastructure has been attacked. This leaves civilians, including women and children, at even greater risk. This is unacceptable. Denmark demands the full, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian and medical staff, and demands that all parties immediately uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law. Second, We are appalled by the reports of ongoing serious human rights violations and abuses taking place in North and South Kivu, including summary executions and sexual and gender-based violence. We condemn any attacks and threats against journalists, human rights defenders, and members of civil society organizations. Those responsible must be held to account. We welcome the recent decision by the Human Rights Council to support such efforts. Third, we reiterate our unwavering support to MONUSCO as it continues its mandated task in a highly complex environment. The actions of the M23 and RDF are not only putting peacekeepers at risk, but also obstructing the implementation of the mission's mandate. The safety and security of UN and humanitarian personnel, including those sheltering in MONUSCO bases, must be ensured. This also goes for freedom of movement of MONUSCO. We reiterate that targeted attacks against MONUSCO peacekeepers constitute a breach of international law, may constitute a war crime, and may serve as a ground for the imposition of UN sanctions. Mr. President, let me conclude by commending the African-led efforts to reach a solution to the crisis in the eastern DRC. Spearheaded by Angolan President Lourenço, we last year saw a glimpse of hope in the Luanda process. That momentum must be maintained. We reaffirm our unwavering support for any future joint peace process owned by and for the region, including by the East African Community, the South African Development Community, and the African Union. As a matter of international peace and security, however, the Security Council has responsibility to take action for the peaceful resolution of the conflict in eastern DRC. It is our duty to urgently consider how to utilize the available means to halt and reverse this escalation, ensure humanitarian access, and safeguard stability in the region. Denmark stands ready to work with all members to this end. I thank you.
感谢丹麦代表的发言，下面我请俄罗斯代表发言。
Господин председатель, благодарим спецпредставителя генерального секретаря Бинту Кейту и спецпосланника Хуанся за брифинги. Приветствуем участие в заседании министра иностранных дел Демократической Республики Конго Терезы Вагнер, а также представителей Руанды, Анголы, Бурунди, Кении, ЮАР и Зимбабве. Хотели бы начать свое выступление с выражения соболезнований семьям граждан ДРК, которые погибли и продолжают гибнуть в результате эскалации со стороны М-23 в последние месяцы. Россия выражает свою солидарность с правительством и народом ДРК в этот сложный период. Мы настаиваем на необходимости безоговорочного уважения суверенитета, территориальной целостности, независимости и единства этой страны в соответствии с Уставом ООН. Мы также вновь выражаем соболезнования семьям погибших миротворцев ООН и павших бойцов сообщества развития Юга Африки. Солидарность с правительствами ДРК и государств, потерявших своих военнослужащих. Нападения на миротворцев неприемлемы ни при каких обстоятельствах. Россия решительно осуждает действия группировки М-23. Призываем к немедленной остановке боестолкновений и выводу бойцов этого незаконного вооруженного формирования из захваченных населенных пунктов, из занятых территорий ДРК. Мы также призываем Руанду отреагировать на соответствующие требования членов Совета Безопасности, а также Афросоюза о снятии своих оборонительных мер и отозвать свои воинские подразделения. Эскалацию на востоке ДРК необходимо остановить. Однако военного пути урегулирования кризиса не существует. Это возможно только в результате политической договоренности ДРК и Руанды, которые должны вернуться за стол переговоров, подтвердить приверженность взаимным обязательствам в рамках луандийского процесса и договориться, как стабилизировать ситуацию. Данный конфликт имеет давнюю и очень кровопролитную историю, и его коренные причины должны быть устранены. Устойчивого урегулирования удастся добиться только после прекращения государственного взаимодействия с незаконными вооруженными формированиями, в их числе и демократические силы освобождения Руанды. Отдельно хотели бы акцентировать, что без урегулирования статуса М-23 в рамках межконгорецкого диалога жизнеспособную политическую формулу прекращения конфликта не найти. Параметры этих процессов должны быть определены совместно Киншасой и Кигали. В противном случае все происходящее сейчас рискует перерасти в межгосударственный конфликт регионального масштаба. мы уже видим все больше предпосылок к этому. Господин председатель, Россия приветствует усилия региональных государств и африканских лидеров по содействию стабилизации на востоке ДРК. Мы отмечаем важные решения по итогам саммитов Евросоюза, САДК, ИВАС, ЭСКЗА. Надеемся, что стороны услышат голоса своих соседей по континенту, а заявленные меры будут приняты и принесут свои результаты. Главным из них должно стать прекращение страданий гражданского населения. Мы глубоко озабочены гуманитарными последствиями эскалации на востоке ДРК. С тревогой следим за поступающими сообщениями о росте случаев внесудебных расправ, нарушений прав человека, сексуального насилия, вербовки детей в ряды НВФ. Все это должно прекратиться. Господин председатель, отдельно хотели бы высказать свою позицию по поводу всем известной, но умышленно обделенной вниманием темы деятельности в ДРК частных военных компаний из Европы. Мы все видели, что они сдали оружие миротворцам ООН с ДРК. Кадры последующей транспортировки европейских наемников в Кигале облетели весь мир. Полагаем, что эти события не совсем совпадают с тем, как Россия видит мандат миссии, выданный ей Советом Безопасности. Убеждены также, что молчаливая реакция наших европейских и американских коллег на столь неоднозначные факты противоречит их декларируемой приверженности к осуждению африканского двустороннего сотрудничества в области безопасности с другими государствами. Это особенно удивительно на фоне многолетнего нагнетания дезинформационной кампании в отношении России из-за укрепления взаимодействия с африканскими государствами в сфере безопасности. Это неоколониальные двойные стандарты во всей их неприглядности. Это, к слову, также одна из причин продолжения конфликтов в Африке. В завершение хотели бы заверить, что Россия продолжит содействовать усилиям по купированию эскалации и восстановлению перспективы дипломатического регулирования. Конголезцам нужны мир, безопасность и уверенность в завтрашнем дне. Именно этим мы руководствуемся в своей работе на площадке этого совета. Благодарю вас.
感谢俄罗斯代表的发言。下面我请英国代表发言。
Thank you, President. I thank SRSG Keita and Special Envoy Shia for their briefings today. And I welcome the participation of DRC Foreign Minister Wagner in this meeting, as well as the representatives from other countries of the region. President, I'll make 3 points. First, we express our deep concern at the continued advance into DRC of the M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces. This is an unacceptable violation of DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity and a breach of the UN Charter. The occupation of Bukavu is a serious escalation which heightens the risk of a wider regional conflict. The United Kingdom is clear that there needs to be an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to dialogue via African-led peace processes. There can be no military solution. As my Foreign Secretary has said, Rwanda must withdraw its troops. The UK is actively considering next steps alongside international partners, including the possibility of a review of all UK support to Rwanda. Second, urgent action is needed to halt the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation. The M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces takeover of Goma has displaced close to 1 million people in North and South Kivu. Hundreds of thousands are now in desperate need of life-saving support. Civilians, particularly women and girls, are at increased risk of violence, including sexual violence. We have seen harrowing reports, including of 165 women raped and many burned alive at Goma Muzenze prison earlier this month. The parties to the conflict must adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. And humanitarian access, especially via Goma Airport, should urgently be restored. Third, MONUSCO's freedom of movement is essential to support the protection of civilians and facilitate aid delivery. Restrictions by the M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces are unacceptable. The parties must respect MONUSCO's mandate as authorised by this Council. The UK strongly condemns all attacks on UN peacekeepers and recalls that attacks on MONUSCO could be grounds for UN sanctions. President, to conclude, the UK welcomes regional efforts to secure a lasting solution to this conflict. We welcome the contribution of the recent joint EAC and SADC summit and the AU-PSC summit. We urge DRC and Rwanda to engage in good faith in existing peace processes. We need to see the rapid implementation of the actions agreed at the summits, supported by urgent action by this Council. I thank you.
感谢英国代表的发言，下面我请韩国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this important meeting. I thank SRSG Keita and Special Envoy Xia for their briefings. I also welcome Foreign Minister Kaikwamba Wagner of DRC to this meeting. The situation in Eastern DRC is urgent. There is almost no single day that passes without a further advancement by the M23. When this Council met for 2 emergency meetings 3 weeks ago, Goma fell for the 5th time in history. Over the last weekend, the M23 took control over Bukavu in South Kivu for the first time ever, escalating this conflict to a completely new sphere by controlling all of Lake Kivu's access points and the DRC-Rwanda border crossings. M23's illegitimate parallel administrations, if sustained for longer, may also create consequences too deep-rooted to reverse. Moreover, the impact on civilians is devastating, causing hundreds of thousands to displace and regressing human rights, particularly in extrajudicial killings, conflict-related sexual violence, and the summary execution of children. The entire DRC is now at stake, and the situation is literally at the brink of full-scale regional war. In light of this perilous situation, let me emphasize 3 points. First, the Republic of Korea strongly condemns and demands an M23 to immediately cease hostilities and withdraw from all occupying areas in North and South Kivu. We also urge Rwanda to refrain from escalating the conflict through its support and participation. We should all be reminded of the fundamental principle of the UN Charter, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Likewise, the DRC should also stop its support to specific armed groups and neutralize the FDLR. Exploiting hate speech and mis- and disinformation campaigns to fuel conflict must also end. All parties to conflict should also ensure MONUSCO's freedom of movement. Any attempt to hinder the implementation of its mandate, particularly through GPS jamming and spoofing, must stop. Attacks on peacekeepers may constitute war crimes, and their safety and security must be prioritized. We cannot lose any more peacekeepers. Second, we urge the DRC and Rwanda to urgently return to meaningful diplomatic dialogue for an unconditional ceasefire. Korea commends and supports the recent joint efforts of the EAC, SADC, AU, and particularly President Lourenço of Angola to find a political solution to this conflict. Now, more than ever, we need Africa's collective wisdom and concerted action for an African solution. We hope that meaningful progress can be achieved by building on the outcomes of the recent EAC-SADC joint statement and the AU-PSC meeting. These efforts should further advance the gains made through the Luanda and the Nairobi processes, paving the way for lasting peace in Eastern DRC. Third, we strongly emphasize the importance of unhindered humanitarian access and the opening of humanitarian corridors in North and South Kivu. Goma and Kavumu airports should be able to operate without restrictions to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid. Key border crossings also need to be open to allow voluntary and safe movement of civilians and people in need. Mr. President, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its steadfast support for MONUSCO, the Office of Special Envoy of the Great Lakes region, and the regional and sub-regional organizations for their efforts in addressing this tragic crisis. The Charter of the UN entrusted this Council to take primary responsibility for the maintenance of the international peace and security. It is time we put our best efforts to fulfill this mandate on this complex conflict. We sincerely hope that the Council will soon be able to pronounce itself with a decisive and unequivocal message for lasting peace in Eastern DRC. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢韩国代表的发言，我现在以中国代表的身份发言。各位同事，首先我感谢凯塔特别代表和夏黄特使所做的通报，欢迎刚果金外长卡伊宽巴女士出席今天的会议。近日，继攻占格马后，323运动再次发起攻势，攻入刚东第二大城市布卡武。刚东局势急剧演变，牵动国际社会的神经。古特雷斯秘书长日前警告，323运动的持续攻势正在将整个地区推向悬崖。刚才各位同事
The statements by colleagues just now have all further highlighted the gravity and danger of the situation in eastern DRC. M23's offensive has seriously violated the decision of the joint EAC SADC summit, requesting all parties to achieve an immediate ceasefire. Completely breached its commitment of a unilateral ceasefire and caused the situation to escalate further. China strongly condemns the military operations by M23 and reiterates that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC should be respected, and that the UN Charter and international law should be observed. I wish to stress the following points. First, the international community should urge M23 to immediately and unconditionally cease its offensive and immediately withdraw from the occupied areas. China reiterates its hope that Rwanda will heed the call of the international community, stop its military support for M23, and immediately withdraw all its military forces from the territory of the DRC. Second, the international community must spare no effort in preventing the conflict in eastern DRC from spiraling into a larger-scale regional conflict. The Congo War over 20 years ago caused millions of casualties. A similar tragedy must not recur. China calls upon relevant regional countries to stay calm and exercise restraint and refrain from actions that could escalate tensions and aggravate antagonism among the parties. Third, the international community should urge all parties to the conflict to abide by international humanitarian law, protect the safety and security of civilians and humanitarians, open up, as a matter of emergency, more humanitarian corridors, reopen the airports in Goma and Bukavu, and fully restore essential services such as water and electricity. MONUSCO carries out its task of protecting civilians in accordance with the Security Council mandate, and all parties must refrain from interference and obstruction. The safety and security of foreign missions, foreign nationals, and enterprises should also be fully guaranteed. Fourth, the international community should continue to support the mediation efforts by the AU and sub-regional organizations. China welcomes the dedication of the AU-PSC summit to promoting the political settlement of the issue of Eastern DRC and expects the outcome of the joint EAC-SADC summit to be implemented without delay. All parties should call upon the DRC and Rwanda to promptly return to the track of diplomacy and address each other's security concerns under the framework of the merged Luanda and Nairobi processes, including eliminating the threat of the FDLR. Fifth, the major stakeholders should fully leverage their influence by actively exerting it on the countries concerned to promote de-escalation of the situation. China supports the Security Council in actively fulfilling its responsibilities in maintaining international peace, taking responsible actions, and forming synergies with regional mediation efforts. China will continue to call on all parties to achieve a ceasefire, end the fighting, and resume dialogue, and will work tirelessly for the de-escalation of the situation. Thank you. I now resume my functions as President of the Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Therese Kaikwamba-Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation, and Francophonie of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Excellencies, Council members, I thank you for convening this third emergency meeting on the situation in Eastern DRC. I wish to thank the special representative of the
ainsi que l'envoyé spécial du secrétaire général pour la région des Grands Lacs, Monsieur Xia Huang, pour leurs exposés respectifs. Je salue également la présence des représentants permanents des différents pays de la région des Grands Lacs ici présents. Le Rwanda prépare un carnage à ciel ouvert avec une brutalité qui rappelle les heures les plus sombres de notre histoire. Le 26 janvier, j'avais prévenu. Aujourd'hui, ces mots sont réalité. En 48 heures seulement, plus de 4000 morts à Goma, des hommes et des femmes abattus, des enfants témoins d'exécutions sommaires, tués sans distinction ou exécutés avec une précision glaçante, comme le chef coutumier de Kiziba, abattu avec son épouse et ses 3 enfants le 11 février, comme l'artiste Delka Idengo, assassiné le 13 février pour imposer le silence. Et ce que nous ne savons n'est qu'une infime partie de l'horreur qui nous parvient. Mais l'horreur ne s'arrête pas aux exécutions. À Goma, la vie est suspendue, prise en otage par la guerre. Plus de 4500 blessés ont afflué vers des hôpitaux débordés. 500 corps ont été retrouvés calcinés dans la prison de Munzenze après des exécutions en masse. Chaque jour, la Croix-Rouge et le CICR ramassent des cadavres dans les rues, tandis que les morgues dépassent leurs capacités. Dans des camps de fortune, les cas de Mpox, choléra et rougeole se propagent, menaçant des milliers de déplacés sans accès à l'eau potable. Ceux qui survivent risquent de mourir autrement, sans aide, sans soins, sans évacuation. Les humanitaires sont pris pour cible, l'accès aux sinistrés bloqué. Voilà ce qui se passe quand un groupe terroriste prend le contrôle d'une ville et impose son administration criminelle sous le regard de ce Conseil. Ce Conseil qui observe, ce Conseil qui condamne, mais ce Conseil qui n'agit pas. Et maintenant, Bukavu. Même scénario. Pillage, hôpitaux détruits, routes coupées. Une guerre qui tue aussi par la faim et la privation des soins. Mais là encore, ce n'est pas suffisant pour ceux qui mènent cette campagne de terreur. À la privation s'ajoute l'exécution. À l'effondrement humanitaire s'ajoute la barbarie. Hier, le 18 février, le Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme a rapporté que des exécutions d'enfants auraient été perpétrées par la coalition RDF-M23. Oui, des enfants, abattus comme des cibles.
Que reste-t-il de l'humanité lorsque même les plus jeunes, les plus innocents sont exécutés? Monsieur le Président, nous avons entendu cette formule devenue un refrain commode des solutions africaines pour des problèmes africains, mais qui ose encore s'en servir aujourd'hui comme prétexte à l'inaction. La communauté de développement de l'Afrique australe, SADC, et la communauté économique des États d'Afrique centrale, CEAC, ont unanimement condamné la présence rwandaise sur notre sol. Ce fait n'est plus contesté. Deux sous-régions, la SADC et l'EAC, ont tenu des réunions conjointes pour adopter des mesures urgentes, y compris un cessez-le-feu. Quant à l'Union africaine, son Conseil de paix et de sécurité, réuni au niveau des chefs d'État le 14 février, a appelé au retrait immédiat de toutes les forces étrangères non invitées de la RDC. En d'autres termes, le Rwanda. Le Rwanda et le M23 ont répondu et continuent de répondre par la violence, par la terreur. Face à l'aggravation rapide de la situation, de nombreux acteurs ont réagi en faisant ce qu'ils savent faire de mieux. Documenter les violations des droits de l'homme, ouvrir la voie à des poursuites pénales, poser des actes forts, mais essentiellement réactifs. Nous saluons la récente décision du Conseil des droits de l'homme de l'ONU d'ouvrir une enquête sur les exactions dans l'Est de la RDC, ainsi que l'appel de la CPI à recueillir des éléments de preuve sur ces crimes pour traduire les responsables en justice. Nous appuyons également la résolution du Parlement européen demandant la suspension de l'accord sur les matières premières entre l'Union européenne et le Rwanda, signé en février 2024, alors que Kigali armait le M23. Mais ce Conseil, toujours inactif, est le seul capable d'empêcher de nouveaux massacres et l'expansion de l'occupation. Il lui revient d'adopter des mesures robustes qui non seulement arrêtent les violences perpétrées par les troupes rwandaises et leurs supplétifs du M23, mais aussi mettent un coup d'arrêt au soutien d'un État membre de l'ONU à un groupe terroriste cherchant à renverser un gouvernement légitime et démocratiquement élu. Ce conflit ne se limite pas aux violences militaires, au pillage de nos ressources ou au déplacement, dépeuplement de nos territoires. C'est un projet politique porté par le Rwanda à travers le M23 et l'AFC visant à renverser notre régime par la force. Mais la République démocratique du Congo a fait le choix de la démocratie. Une démocratie en construction, certes, mais la nôtre. Nous avons choisi la liberté sous un régime civil et non la soumission aux armes. Nul ne peut nous arracher ce choix, surtout pas un régime qui, depuis 3 décennies, s'efface derrière un homme qui confond l'État avec son pouvoir personnel. Ce contraste est saisissant. D'un côté, un peuple qui bâtit son avenir sur la volonté populaire, de l'autre, un régime qui ne survit que par la force, l'intimidation et la répression. Aujourd'hui, ce modèle de gouvernance par la peur tente de s'imposer chez nous. Ce n'est pas seulement une guerre pour un territoire, mais une guerre contre notre choix souverain d'un avenir différent. Le M23 et ses soutiens rwandais cherchent à imposer par les armes ce que les urnes ont rejeté. Mais le peuple congolais dit non. Un peuple dont l'âge moyen est de moins de 25 ans, un peuple marqué par la guerre et les promesses ajournées, mais qui refuse la loi des armes. Il veut choisir ses dirigeants dans les urnes et non sous la menace des canons. Il refuse d'être la génération sacrifiée d'une violence imposée de l'extérieur. Mr. President, this Council must act. It can no longer remain a silent witness to an unfolding tragedy, nor hide behind declarations of intent. The time for theoretical debates is over. It is now time to uphold the very principles that define this institution: peace, security, and respect for international law. International law that is universal and applies to all, even while seeking African solutions. Standing by silently while civilians are killed is not a solution, and certainly not an African one. We reiterate the urgency of these measures and demand immediate action. First, the Security Council must order an end to Rwanda's hostilities and demand the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of its troops from Congolese territory. These forces have trampled on international law, brought death and devastation, and violated our sovereignty. Their withdrawal is not negotiable it is an imperative. Second, the Security Council must impose targeted sanctions, including asset freezes and travel bans, on the command structure of the Rwandan Defense Forces and the political decision makers responsible for this aggression, including those who feign ignorance of their own troops' whereabouts. Thousands of Rwandan soldiers are leading M23 operations in our country, while their president, in a calculated display of plausible deniability, says, "I don't know." But you, members of the Council, know. We all know. The survivors who had to bury 4,000 bodies in Goma know. And in Goma, those graves bear witness. Third, the Security Council must impose a total ban on the export of all minerals from Rwanda, particularly coltan and gold, in order to end the looting of our resources. The DRC has taken its own measures by designating several mining sites as red zones, including Rubaya, from where Rwanda fraudulently exports over 150 tons of coltan each month. But national measures alone are not enough. As long as Rwanda is allowed to launder our resources with impunity, this war will continue. Fourth, the Security Council must immediately revoke Rwanda's status as a troop contributing country to United Nations peacekeeping missions. A country that besieges MONUSCO bases, targets its aircrafts, and launches deadly attacks on UN peacekeepers, then goes further, using the repatriation of fallen peacekeepers as a political bargaining chip, has defied the very principles of peacekeeping. This contradiction erodes the credibility of the United Nations. Rwanda's status must be revoked without delay. Fifth, the Security Council must impose a strict notification and monitoring mechanism for any sale or transfer of arms to Rwanda. Every shipment of weapon destined for Kigali must be declared, traced, and closely monitored. It is unacceptable that arms continue to reach groups responsible for massacres and regional destabilization and under United Nations sanctions. Monsieur le Président, 3 réunions en moins d'1 mois. Aujourd'hui, vous avez tous condamné le Rwanda dans vos discours. Je m'excuse. Tous, sauf les A3, à savoir l'Algérie, la Somalie et la Sierra Leone. Mais il n'y a toujours pas de résolution. Le temps des compromis interminables est révolu. Il est temps d'agir. La République démocratique du Congo exige un vote public dans les plus brefs délais sur une résolution qui dénonce clairement l'occupation du Rwanda et qui exige le retrait de ses troupes, une résolution qui défend la Charte des Nations Unies. Assez de prétextes, assez de relativisme culturel derrière lequel se cache un attentisme aux conséquences tragiques. Que chacun assume sa position au grand jour. Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du Conseil, il est temps de voter. Je vous remercie.
我感谢卡伊宽巴瓦格纳女士阁下的发言。下面我请卢旺达代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Allow me first to congratulate you on your presidency and leadership of this council. I also thank Ambassador Huang Xia and SRC Bintu Keita for their briefings. I also recognize the participation of Honorable Teresa Kaikamba Wagner, Minister of Foreign Affairs of DRC, and the representatives of Kenya, Angola, Burundi, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Mr. President, Rwanda commends the regional efforts led by the East African Community and the Southern African Development Corporation, SADC, particularly the joint summit held in Dar es Salaam on 8 February 2025. The joint summit meeting resulted in positive outcomes, including 1, a call for a ceasefire, 2, urgent humanitarian support, and 3, the merger of the Rwanda and Nairobi peace processes to be led by a panel of facilitators from different regions under President Lorenzo. The joint EAC-SADC summit also directed resumption of direct negotiations and dialogue with all state and non-state parties, military and non-military, including the M23. These outcomes were endorsed by the by an extraordinary AU Peace and Security Council meeting at the head of state level, held on 14 February 2025, as well as the AU Assembly of Heads of State, held on 15th to 16th February 2025. Mr. President, Rwanda appreciates the support of those in this Council who value Africa-led solutions. We remain fully engaged in these efforts and continue to support them with good faith and full commitment. However, we must condemn the actions of those, including a DRC, who undermine these efforts by lobbying Western capitals instead of engaging with African leadership and regional mechanisms. Despite the critical nature of the recent regional discussions, the DRC has consistently opted for virtual presence or outright disengagement in these key meetings. While regional leaders gathered at the AU summit to address the Eastern DRC security situation, the president of DRC, President Tshisekedi, was instead seen at the Munich Security Conference, continuing to call for sanctions and lobbying for sanctions against Rwanda rather than engaging in direct dialogues. Other heads of state were sitting in Addis trying to find solutions to these problems. So the biggest beneficiary of these discussions could have been benefited by being in that room. I cannot emphasize this enough. African leadership must drive the resolution of this conflict. Failure to support regional solutions has exacerbated instability in the past. This is why Rwanda calls for the full endorsement of the AU-backed EAC-SADC joint summit outcomes. Furthermore, at the heart of this crisis is a dangerous alliance between the DRC government and external actors, mainly the FDR genocidal militia, who have fueled the ethnic rhetoric and enabled extremism to thrive for decades, but also the Burundian forces, the Sami DRC, as well as European mercenaries. Council members, instead of committing to inclusive dialogue, the DRC has consistently undermined regional mechanisms, pitted regional blocs against each other, disregarded ceasefires, refused dialogue with its own people, and escalated ethnic-based violence. Mr. President, Council members, since the fall of Goma, regional leaders have worked tirelessly to broker peace. Yet, the DRC government has responded by reinforcing its front lines with more troops and Burundian forces. This reckless militarization, coupled with state-sponsored incitement to violence, has created a lawless environment. The uncontrolled distribution of weapons has even led former DRC government-aligned militia to turn against Kinshasa. This we have always said. When a state actor proliferates and distributes weapons to negative armed groups, like the different Wazalendo groups, what you reap is chaos. And what we've seen in terms of the magnitude of loss of life caused by Wazalendo and all these young people who have been given thousands of weapons and mobilized and turned against each other, that's what we reap. Inflammatory statements from DRC officials, such as those made by the Honorable Minister in the previous Council meeting on the 29th January 2025, calling for, and I quote, the streets to take over, have worsened the situation. Indeed, soon after the Honorable Minister's foretelling in this Council, we observed cases of youth mobilization in 2 armed militia in South Kivu, led by known FARDC officers. Arming young civilians in an already unstable context is not only reckless, but an outright incitement to hatred and violence. And there is a lot of misinformation here. When FARDC forces were proliferating arms and including arming children, nobody talked about this. Nobody spoke. And now you see misinformation about execution of children. I repeat, the proliferation of arms by a state actor to negative armed groups, and there are over 250 armed groups documented in DRC. That is a recipe for disaster. And that's the disaster that we continue to see. Arms should be proliferated to designated trained officers and military officers. The situation has deteriorated to the point where we see a lot of humanitarian challenges. Rwanda cannot take the blame for the problems that DRC has faced endemically. As President Kagame stated in Addis Ababa, and I quote, "We have our own problems to deal with. Congo is too big for Rwanda to carry on its back," end of quote. Rwanda has no interest in DRC's internal struggles. Allegations of land grabbing in courts or corrupt or occupation ignore fundamental power imbalances at play in the DRC. Our sole priority has always been and will always remain the security of our borders and the stability of our nation. We have stated over and over again the existential security threat that Rwanda faces from DRC, and these we take very seriously. Council members, Rwanda continues to welcome refugees fleeing the violence in the DRC, despite persistent calls from the DRC and its allies to impose sanctions on Rwanda. Ironically, among those crossing into Rwanda are the same security threats we have repeatedly warned this esteemed council about. On the 29th January, over 280 foreign mercenaries, along with over 100 Congolese soldiers, crossed into Rwanda territory, exposing the FARDC's long-standing use of foreign fighters with no reaction whatsoever from the international community. Yet, as we have repeatedly said, the use of mercenaries by state actors contravenes the 1989 United Nations Convention and the 1977 OAU Convention, which prohibits and illegalizes the use of mercenaries by states. More concerning is the international community's reluctance to address the existential threat Rwanda faces, the ethnic cleansing of Congolese Tutsi, and the misinterpretation of the conflict. Instead of acknowledging the DRC's responsibility, blame has been conveniently shifted, first to Rwanda, and now even to former President Joseph Kabila. When will this blame game end? I think someone here has to take responsibility. Reality has always been clear. The M23's resurgence is rooted in decades-long persecution of Congolese communities based on ethnicity, predating Rwanda's current government. Rwanda has consistently warned that the FDR is central to this crisis. Since 2018, over 20 incursions have been launched into Rwanda, particularly in the southern province and in the northwestern region. Despite claim that the FDR is a weakened force, its active collaboration with and financing by FARDC proves otherwise. The DRC government must recognize that its coalition with the FDR destabilizes Rwanda and perpetuates suffering among Congolese civilians. Ignoring the FDR's role is a failure to hold accountable those responsible for exporting extremist ideology beyond Rwanda's borders. But beyond the FDR, Council members, Rwanda is also concerned by a myriad of foreign forces deployed along its borders, namely the Burundian forces that share the same ethnic ideology as the FDR, SAMI DRC, and the remaining mercenaries. We are also concerned by the President of DRC's push for more foreign troops he is currently requesting from other African countries. All those foreign forces need to withdraw from Eastern DRC as they constitute a direct threat to Rwanda's security. In fact, when Goma fell, FARDC, Burundian forces, and FDLR forces turned their weapons on Rwanda, killing 16 innocent civilians and wounding 177 civilians, and destroying their properties and livelihoods. Yet no country condemned this blatant violation of Rwanda's sovereignty. Rwanda has no choice but to strengthen its defense and will continue to do so. Mr. President, on the question of MONUSCO, we have been very, very clear, and Rwanda's position remains peacekeepers have to be safe, peacekeepers have to be protected, and that is a canon that we respect, and we have said it over and over again. However, transparency is also very important. Information to the Council that is accurate is critical. There is critical information that we believe SRSG Bintu Keita should have shared with the Council on MONUSCO's collaboration with M23, and specifically the outcome of a meeting that was held yesterday between DSRSG, Vivian van der Per, and the leader of AFC/M23, Colonel Nanga. We believe that that information would have been critical to share so that at least the Council knows. Mr. President, regarding mineral exploitation, the responsible parties are well known who exploit DRC. Rwanda holds no mining concession in the DRC, yet we continue to be falsely accused. The claim that mineral resources fuel this conflict is false and inciting. The M23 issue is about people fighting for their rights and survival, fighting for their inherent citizenship rights and access to their own ancestral property. Rwanda cannot be scapegoated for the DRC's economic dysfunction. It is Congolese officials who benefit most from instability and the corrupt mining sector, whereas Rwanda has always promoted responsible sourcing and formalized trade to curb smuggling and illicit activities in mining. Mr. President, Council members, Rwanda remains committed to regional mechanisms to neutralize the FDLR and ensure the withdrawal of all foreign forces that threaten our security. These steps are essential for Rwanda's stability and lasting regional peace. Once these conditions are met, Rwanda will adjust its defensive measures accordingly. We urge the DRC to engage genuinely in the EAC SADC peace process and call on the international community to support these Africa-led initiatives rather than imposing counterproductive measures. If sanctions or punitive measures were the solution to this region's problems, Rwanda would be the first to support them. However, history has shown otherwise. These only deepen division and undermine regional peace efforts. To conclude, Mr. President, Council members, Rwanda remains guided by the firm belief that our region's future depends on unity, shared prosperity, and inclusive peace. The historical and cultural ties between our communities hold untapped potential, and we hope that through dialogue and cooperation, we can bring lasting peace and development this region desperately needs. I thank you.
我感谢罗旺达代表的发言，下面我请安哥拉代表发言。
Mr. President, thank you for giving us the floor. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, we acknowledge the presence of Her Excellency Therese Kayekwamba Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie from the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and His Excellency Ambassador Ernest Raimusillo, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Rwanda to the United Nations. We thank Mrs. Bintu Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary General in the DRC and Head of United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in DRC, and Mr. Wang Shi, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for the Great Lake region, for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, we are holding the third Security Council emergency meeting in less than a month to address the situation in eastern DRC as the M23 continues widening its offensive and making significant military advances in North Kivu and South Kivu provinces, despite calls by this Council, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, and other actors in the international community to halt its operations. Angola firmly and unequivocally condemns and repudiates these actions, which can have unforeseen consequences for regional peace and security
if not stopped now. We are very concerned with these latest developments and reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of M23 from occupied areas, as well as the end to the establishment of parallel administration in the DRC territory. In line with the UN Charter, the international law, and the principle of sovereign equality of all member states, the sovereignty, independence, and unity and territorial integrity of DRC must be respected and upheld. Angola calls on the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights, protect civilians, internal displaced people's camps and medical camps, and safeguard the integrity and safety of peacekeepers and humanitarian personnel. Attacks against civilians and peacekeepers constitute war crimes, and the perpetrators must be held accountable. As any other country, DRC has the right to live in peace and security to achieve sustainable development. This Council has the responsibility to assist the people and the government of DRC to achieve these aspirations by acting swiftly and decisively to prevent further escalation of this conflict and promote its peaceful resolution through the Luanda and Nairobi processes. We call on the members of the Security Council to work expeditiously to adopt a resolution, namely urging the immediate and unconditional ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, and the peaceful resolution of the conflict through the Luanda and Nairobi processes, in line with the communiques of the Joint East African Community and SADC Summit of Heads of State and Government, convened on 8 February 2025, and the Peace and Security Council of the African Union meeting at the Heads of State and Government level, held on 14 February 2025. Mr. President, on 14 February, His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, who was mandated by the African Union as chair of the International Conference on the Great Lake region to ensure mediation of the crisis between DRC and Rwanda, presented a report to the Peace and Security Council of the African Union outlining his efforts to achieve peace to this protracted conflict. He stressed that the progress made under the Luanda process must be preserved and upheld, which include the declaration of ceasefire of 4 August 2024, the adoption of the harmonized plan for the neutralization of the FDLR and the disengagement force lifting of defense security measure by Rwanda, the adoption of the concept of operations, CONOPS, and the operationalization of the reinforced ad hoc verification mechanism. Please note that the only pending matter to finalize and consolidate the draft peace agreement proposed by the mediator is the divergency regarding the resolution of the M23 issue, which falls within the scope of the Nairobi process. It is important to emphasize that the M23 issue is not objectively and directly part of the Luanda process mandate, since it has always been understood that the matters relating to the different armed groups operating within DRC should be dealt with within the framework of the Nairobi process. His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço has reiterated time and time again that the conflict and security challenge in the eastern DRC have no military solution, and urged the parties to return to the negotiating table immediately. He continues making diplomatic efforts in favor of peace and stability in the DRC, now in a new and additional role as the chair of the African Union since 15 February 2025. At the sidelines of the Peace and Security Council meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on 14 February, he met His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda, and yesterday in Luanda, Angola, he hosted His Excellency Felix Tshisekedi, President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, to discuss the way forward. We call on the international community and the Security Council to continue supporting the ongoing regional initiatives to enhance coordination, harmonization, and complementarity between Luanda and Nairobi process to promote African solutions to African problems. Mr. President, a speed and unconditional de-escalation of the conflict and the genuine and renewed engagement of the parties to explore ways of overcoming the pending issue are paramount to create a political environment conducive to a peaceful solution under the Luanda and Nairobi processes. We encourage all the parties to avoid any actions or rhetoric that can further escalate tensions, including provocative language or inflammatory public statements, since they are counterproductive to the diplomatic efforts to achieve lasting solution to this conflict that has prevailed for so long. As His Excellency President João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço stated during the Peace and Security Council of the African Union meeting, and I quote, "It is only makes sense to continue the peace effort in the eastern of DRC if there is serious engagement from the parties and coherence regarding the commitments made, so that the time and energy are not wasted on actions that have been undertaken to restore peace to this attacked sister country." End of quote. I thank you for your attention.
我感谢安哥拉代表的发言，下面我请肯尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Kenya congratulates the People's Republic of China on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of February and commends Algeria for its stewardship in January. We also thank the briefers as well as Minister Wagner of the Democratic Republic of Congo and my colleague peers from the region. Mr. President, Kenya is concerned. Kenya is deeply concerned over the escalating unrest in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which imperils the stability of our entire Great Lakes region. The loss of lives of civilians and peacekeepers and the displacement of persons that characterize the conflict compound the already dire humanitarian situation in Eastern DRC. We reiterate the call of the joint EAC-SADC summit for an immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities by all the conflicting parties and the withdrawal of foreign actors from the DRC. The attendant effects of the unrest remain dire for the entire Great Lakes region. Widespread displacement of persons, an influx of refugees, the spread of infectious diseases, and increased arms proliferation. In addition, the threat of terrorism posed by ISIS DRC risks burgeoning as the group leverages the unrest to advance its nefarious activities. Mr. President, Kenya is the current chair of the East African Community, and it reiterates the joint EAC-SADC summit's position to advance a political rather than a military solution in addressing this conflict. In this regard, we reaffirm our commitment to the Nairobi-Luanda process as the most viable framework for dialogue and reconciliation. We also urge the parties, all parties, to exercise political goodwill and genuinely engage in mediation. We call upon our dear neighbors, DRC, Rwanda, and all others to please tone down the finger-pointing and give dialogue a chance. It is in our collective interest as a region. Please let's tone down the finger-pointing and give dialogue a chance. It is in our collective interest as a region. Whereas Kenya remains committed to supporting diplomatic efforts to restore stability in Eastern DRC, the international community must do more. We therefore call upon this Council to act decisively to contain the prevailing unrest. We must put an end to the death and humanitarian suffering of local populations. UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations must be given unhindered access. On our part, Kenya remains committed to all efforts that will bring peace and stability, not just to Eastern DRC, but to the entire Great Lakes region. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢肯尼亚代表的发言，下面我请布隆迪代表发言。
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi tout d'abord d'exprimer notre reconnaissance à la République populaire de Chine, qui assure la présidence de ce Conseil pour le mois de février, pour avoir convoqué cette troisième réunion en un mois sur la situation en République démocratique du Congo. Cette initiative témoigne de l'engagement de la République populaire de Chine envers la paix et la sécurité dans la région des Grands Lacs et son rôle de leadership au sein du Conseil de sécurité. Nous tenons à remercier Madame Bintou Keïta, représentante spéciale du secrétaire général des Nations Unies et chef de la MONUSCO, et M. Xia, envoyé spécial du secrétaire général des Nations Unies pour la région des Grands Lacs, pour leur présentation riche en informations sur la situation en RDC. Je tiens à saluer particulièrement Son Excellence Madame la ministre des Affaires étrangères de la RDC et les collègues qui sont ici présents. Le Burundi tient tout d'abord à rappeler qu'il se trouve en RDC dans le cadre strictement d'un accord bilatéral conformément au communiqué de presse de la FDN du 20 mai 2023. Monsieur le Président, le Burundi, fidèle à ses principes de paix et de solidarité, demeure profondément préoccupé par la détérioration de la situation en RDC. La persistance des conflits, particulièrement à l'est de la RDC, la prise de Goma par le M23 soutenu par le Rwanda et l'occupation prolongée de vastes zones par des forces étrangères constituent une menace grave pour la stabilité régionale. Cette situation met en lumière les limites et faiblesses de nos mécanismes de paix actuels. Et il est impératif que la communauté internationale prenne des mesures immédiates pour prévenir une guerre régionale. À cet égard, le Burundi propose un plan de paix en 5 points qui s'articule autour des principes de dialogue, de coopération régionale et du respect des souverainetés nationales. Nous croyons fermement qu'une solution durable au conflit en RDC nécessite une action collective, urgente et coordonnée. Voici les éléments clés de notre plan de paix. 1. Mobilisation internationale pour éviter l'escalade du conflit. Il est impératif que la communauté internationale, y compris les Nations Unies et les acteurs régionaux, s'engagent de manière urgente pour prévenir l'escalade du conflit en RDC et exercer les pressions nécessaires sur les acteurs impliqués dans l'agression de la RDC en violation des principes cardinaux de la Charte des Nations Unies, notamment la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de la RDC, ainsi que son indépendance politique en vue d'obtenir des actes concrets. Si aucune action immédiate n'est entreprise, la crise pourrait se transformer en un conflit régional plus vaste, menaçant non seulement la RDC, mais aussi toute la région des Grands Lacs. Nous appelons à une réponse rapide, cohérente et déterminée pour éviter un embrasement régional dont personne ne peut prédire avec précision les conséquences sécuritaires et humanitaires dans la région, avec des ramifications possibles sur les autres régions du continent. 2. Le retrait des forces étrangères non invitées et le démantèlement des groupes armés. Pour parvenir à une paix durable, il est nécessaire que les forces étrangères non invitées, y compris celles du Rwanda, se retirent immédiatement de la RDC et respectent son intégrité territoriale. Parallèlement, la communauté internationale doit soutenir activement le démantèlement de tous les groupes armés, à la fois locaux et étrangers, dont les FDLR, qui continuent de nourrir l'instabilité dans la région. Il est crucial que ces actions soient menées de manière à protéger les civils congolais qui sont les principales victimes de cette violence. L'inertie et l'attentisme de la communauté internationale nourrit la poursuite des combats et l'appétit de l'agresseur à poursuivre l'occupation des territoires congolais, ce qui pourrait créer un mauvais précédent de nature à pousser les autres États d'user de la force pour grignoter sur les territoires des autres États indépendants sans craindre l'action de la communauté internationale. Un jour de plus, sans action concrète d'arrêter la guerre à l'est de la RDC, équivaut à des centaines de morts de civils innocentes, y compris les femmes et les enfants. Non, agissons vite pour être du bon côté de l'histoire, sinon, en cas d'immobilisme, l'histoire retiendra qu'à un moment donné, la communauté internationale a laissé la situation à l'est de la RDC se dégrader avec des conséquences graves sur le plan sécuritaire et humanitaire. La crédibilité de ce prestigieux Conseil, organe chargé de la paix et de la sécurité internationale, en dépend. 3. Le M23 est la voie du dialogue intercongolais. Quant au M23, il est impératif que ce groupe, s'il se revendique congolais, intègre le processus de paix intercongolais sous la facilitation du président Uhuru Kenyatta, facilitateur désigné par la communauté est-africaine. Ce processus devrait permettre aux Congolais de trouver eux-mêmes des solutions à leurs problèmes sans ingérence extérieure. Nous croyons que le dialogue interne est la seule voie pour arriver à une paix durable en RDC, respectant la souveraineté et l'intégrité du pays. 4. Un cessez-le-feu immédiat et inconditionnel. Nous appelons également à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et sans condition pour permettre l'acheminement de l'assistance humanitaire et créer un environnement propice au dialogue intercongolais. Ce cessez-le-feu serait un premier pas vers une solution pacifique du conflit, réduisant la souffrance des civils, en particulier des femmes et des enfants, qui sont les premières victimes de cette guerre. Une fois respecté, le cessez-le-feu permettra de favoriser un climat favorable au dialogue intercongolais et au retour des déplacés internes et aux réfugiés de retourner dans leur foyer et les élèves à l'école. 5. Renforcement des mécanismes régionaux et internationaux. Enfin, il est crucial de renforcer le Conseil de paix et de sécurité de l'Union africaine et d'assurer un financement suffisant pour les opérations de paix en Afrique. Le Burundi plaide également pour une accélération de l'opérationnalisation de la force africaine en attente afin de permettre à l'Afrique de répondre efficacement à ses propres crises. Une coopération renforcée entre l'Union africaine, les Nations unies et les acteurs régionaux est essentielle pour garantir une réponse cohérente et efficace face à ces défis. Monsieur le Président, le Burundi réaffirme son engagement envers la paix et la stabilité en RDC et dans la région des Grands Lacs. Nous croyons fermement que seule une action collective et une coopération internationale renforcée permettront de surmonter les défis auxquels la RDC est confrontée. Nous appelons tous les membres du Conseil de sécurité à soutenir ce plan de paix dans un esprit de solidarité et de responsabilité partagée pour garantir un avenir pacifique et prospère pour tous les peuples de la région. En définitive, le Burundi, comme beaucoup de pays africains, soutient le projet de résolution REV 2 en circulation sur la RDC dans sa version actuelle et appelle tous les membres du Conseil de sécurité et tout particulièrement, je dis bien tout particulièrement les A3, à savoir l'Algérie, la Sierra Leone et la Somalie, de le soutenir pour respecter le souhait de l'écrasante majorité d'Africains qui condamnent la violation flagrante de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de la RDC. Aucun pays, aucun peuple ne souhaiterait que son territoire et sa souveraineté soient violés au grand jour, au vu et au su de tout le monde. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
我感谢布隆迪代表的发言，下面我请南非代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to once again congratulate the People's Republic of China on assuming the presidency of the Council for the month of February. We thank Special Representative Bintu Keita and Special Envoy Huang Xia for their important briefings. And we acknowledge the presence of Minister of Foreign Affairs of the DRC, Her Excellency Ms. Teresa Kaikwamba Wagner. South Africa wishes to thank the United Nations and its member states for sharing our grief as we mourn the death of our peacekeepers in the Eastern DRC. We express gratitude to all that played a role in the successful repatriation of the remains of our fallen troops. Mr. President, since the emergency meetings of the Security Council on 26 and 28 January 2025, the situation in the Eastern DRC has deteriorated. Despite repeated calls for a ceasefire and restraint, the M23 and its allies continue to capture territories in the eastern region of the DRC. The capital of North Kivu, Goma, as well as other cities such as Bukavu, are now under the full control of the M23. The supply of electricity, water, humanitarian aid and communication networks have been disrupted, putting the lives of many injured and the displaced communities at high risk. Mr. President, the recent African Union Summit reiterated the need for all of the parties to the conflict to engage in negotiations towards a sustainable political solution. This decision reinforces the outcomes of the seminal joint summit of the East African Community, the EAC, and the South African Development Community, SADC. We believe that the measure of the Luanda and Nairobi processes, as decided by the joint summit, is prudent for a harmonized and coherent approach to dealing with the prevailing situation in Eastern DRC. Both processes must prioritize, as a matter of urgency, addressing the proliferation and activities of armed groups. All illegal armed groups and uninvited armed forces from neighboring countries are an obstacle to peace and stability in the entire region. All key actors must demonstrate political will to put an end to the crisis. For this reason, South Africa strongly urges all parties to the conflict to engage in de-escalation efforts, confidence-building measures, and fulfill the already agreed terms of the Luanda process. This includes an immediate ceasefire, the implementation of the harmonization plan for the neutralization of the FDLR, the disengagement of foreign forces in the territory of the DRC, and for all parties to participate fully in the ad hoc verification mission monitoring the ceasefire. Alongside the ongoing political process, all parties must ensure that humanitarian efforts are unimpeded and essential services are restored in Goma and other affected areas. Should the parties fail to reach any meaningful progress, despite myriad efforts and decisions aimed at bringing about peace and stability, the Security Council must assume its role by taking measures within its mandate to prevent further carnage in the Eastern DRC. The situation in the Eastern DRC requires a set of immediate measures to mitigate further death and suffering, and to end the capture and control of territory by the M23 and its allies. In this context, we look forward to this Council adopting the draft resolution before it, and hope that it will help with the immediate cessation of hostilities and aid the political process. In conclusion, Mr. President, for the African continent to prosper, we need to truly silence the guns and harness our collective efforts towards development-focused solutions to prolonged challenges. Together, let us make a paradigm shift from the battlegrounds of war to the corridors of diplomacy and seek solutions through compromise above the rigid ideologies of war that often seek absolute victories. History has taught us that absolute victories in war are hollow and simply allow for the continuation of conflict in different forms, often for decades to come. The parties to the conflict must choose peace and negotiate in good faith, with lasting peace as the ultimate prize for the sake of the future of the DRC, the Great Lakes region, and Africa as a whole. I thank you.
我感谢南非代表的发言，下面我请津巴布韦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Zimbabwe appreciates the briefings provided today and welcomes the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and La Francophonie of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Her Excellency Therese Kaikwamba Wagner. The security situation in the Eastern DRC remains a matter of grave concern. That is why our region has devoted significant time and resources to addressing this crisis, recognizing its far-reaching implications for peace, stability, and development, not only in the DRC, but across the broader Great Lakes region. Indeed, some of our SADC citizens have made the ultimate sacrifice in pursuit of peace in the DRC. Recent high-level engagements underscore the urgency of the situation. The SADC Extraordinary Summit on 31 January 2025, followed by the joint SADC-EAC Summit on 8 February 2025, and the African Union Peace and Security Council Summit on 14 February 2025, all reaffirm the importance of African-led solutions. These efforts reflect the principle of subsidiarity.
Mr. President, the principal responsibility for maintaining international peace and security rests with the United Nations Security Council. We therefore urge the Council to align its actions with the decisions and recommendations of African-led initiatives. Strengthening these regional mechanisms will ensure a more coordinated, effective, and contextually relevant response. Zimbabwe calls for support to ongoing regional efforts, particularly within the frameworks of the Luanda and Nairobi processes. These initiatives are essential in addressing the escalating insecurity fueled by the insurgencies of M23 and other armed groups. In that regard, Zimbabwe welcomes the ongoing negotiations on the Security Council draft resolution. We hope that its adoption will complement regional efforts to achieve a peaceful solution to the conflict, and we hope that this will happen without any further delay. My delegation wishes to highlight 5 further priorities essential for restoring peace and stability in the DRC. 1, immediate cessation of hostilities and an unconditional ceasefire. Without an immediate and sustained ceasefire, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC will remain under threat with dire consequences for regional security. 2, withdrawal of M23 and its allies from captured territories, including Goma and Bukavu. 3, withdrawal of all foreign forces present in the DRC without invitation, including from neighboring countries. 4, protection of civilians and facilitation of humanitarian assistance. The ongoing conflict has inflicted untold suffering, leading to widespread displacement and humanitarian distress. It is imperative that humanitarian assistance reaches those most in need, while humanitarian actors are guaranteed a safe and secure environment to undertake their work. 5, ending the illicit exploitation and trafficking of natural resources. Addressing this root cause of conflict is critical to breaking the cycle of violence and fostering sustainable development in the DRC. Further, Zimbabwe strongly condemns attacks against UN peacekeepers and regional troops, which constitute violations of international law and may amount to war crimes. We denounce assault on SAMI DRC forces whose deployment was endorsed by the African Union Peace and Security Council in March 2024. Ensuring their safety is paramount. Mr. President, the Security Council must recognize that African-led peace processes offer the most viable path to a lasting solution in the DRC. Supporting the full implementation and harmonization of the Luanda-Nairobi processes is key to restoring stability. We therefore urge the Council to reinforce these mechanisms and ensure that its interventions align and support these efforts. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢津巴布韦代表的发言，我下面请马拉维代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me first to congratulate China for assuming the chairmanship of the Security Council for the month. I'd like to thank the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Affairs, Cooperation and the Francophone of DRC, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Council. The Republic of Malawi, as a committed member of the African Union and the Southern African Development Community, SADC, is joining shared concerns as advocated by the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, the Eastern African Community, the Economic Community of the Central African States, and other regional and international bodies, and is deeply concerned with the deteriorating security and humanitarian situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The ongoing offensive in both North Kivu and South Kivu, particularly involving the M23 supported by Rwanda, which has resulted in significant civilian suffering and regional instability. The Republic of Malawi stands in solidarity with the regional and international bodies and supports all efforts aimed at restoring peace, security, and stability in the region. The Republic of Malawi recognizes the complex and multifaceted nature of the conflict in the Eastern DRC and wish to emphasize the importance of a collaborative and inclusive approach to resolving the crisis. We commend the efforts of the African Union, the Eastern African Community, the Economic Community of the Central African States, the ICGLR, and SADC in addressing the situation and working towards sustainable peace. The Republic of Malawi fully supports the resolution aimed at restoring peace in Eastern DRC and echoes the call for all parties to engage in dialogue, cease hostilities, and prioritize the protection of civilians because one death is a life too many to lose. As a party to various regional and international peace instruments, the Republic of Malawi reaffirms its commitment to supporting initiatives that promote peace, security, and development in the Great Lakes region. We urge all stakeholders to work together in a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect to address the root causes of the conflict and ensure a peaceful environment for all. Malawi stands ready to contribute to these efforts and to support all parties' strong desire to pursue long-lasting peace in DRC. This is why Malawi has never hesitated to assist in such situations as a moral obligation. The Republic of Malawi is very concerned about reports of serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses by armed groups in DRC, including claims of high levels of sexual and gender-based violence. The Republic of Malawi is equally concerned with a growing number of forcibly displaced persons in eastern DRC because of the deteriorating security and humanitarian situation, and reiterates the need for all parties to pursue dialogue and to amicably resolve the crisis in DRC. On the same tone, the Republic of Malawi deplores any attacks on peacekeepers and humanitarian agents aimed at contributing to peace-building processes in DRC. As a committed member of the AU and SADC and advocate of the principles of other regional and international bodies, the Republic of Malawi calls for an immediate end of such attacks and urges all stakeholders to ensure the safety and security of peacekeepers and humanitarian personnel. Finally, Mr. President, allow me to thank the United Nations, member states, and all those partners who supported Malawi to repatriate the remains of our fallen troops back to Malawi, and those continuing to support peacekeeping operations missions. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢马拉维代表的发言。刚果民主共和国国务部长兼外交国际合作和法语国家事务部长卡伊宽巴瓦格纳女士阁下要求再次发言，我现在请她发言。
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du Conseil, depuis des mois, nous écoutons le Rwanda tenter de justifier l'injustifiable. Justifier son agression répétée, sa guerre d'occupation et le pillage de nos ressources. Aujourd'hui encore, nous avons entendu le représentant rwandais essayer de légitimer non seulement les attaques du Rwanda contre la République démocratique du Congo et son peuple, mais aussi ses attaques contre l'architecture juridique même de cette organisation. Nous avons écouté le Rwanda chercher à légitimer sa guerre après le déplacement de millions de civils, après le pillage de nos ressources par centaines de tonnes et même après l'assassinat de dizaines de casques bleus et de soldats de la paix africains. Je rappelle à ce Conseil que hier, le haut-commissaire aux droits de l'homme a documenté des exécutions sommaires d'enfants par la coalition RDF M23 à Bukavu. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du Conseil, tenter de justifier l'exécution d'enfants est si abject et ignoble que cela ne recevra aucune réponse de ma part aujourd'hui. Monsieur le représentant permanent du Rwanda, vous avez déjà perdu le combat de la vérité. Merci.
我感谢凯伊宽巴瓦格纳女士阁下的发言。发言名单上没有其他人，现在休会。
impyisi mahome impyisi nahetse gisa wapfuye yarihuse yariwe n'imbwa isirebera bunyenyezi bye nabayingana n'iyo nkubiri murabyumva gisa wapfuye yarihuse agahinda kanjye wabana kumva gukora imyaka ntarya ntaryama impyisi mahome impyisi nahetse kanyitura kurya wo mbyara gatuna mbwene n'akandoye ubu zagasabo hacura intimba u Rwanda rwose ruraboroga intero twaje ari Nyamirambo igihugu cyose turarurwana miyove yose na za Nyacyonga iyo zabatsinda na za Gasanze Kagugu yose Gisozi nuko iyo Nyamijosi ndi kuwareba nitwarutashye imvugo idahwitse impyisi mahome impyisi nahetse impyisi bihe ubwirinanura iti nshyira hasi njye mu rugwiro umuhutu nsanga waragatuye ndetse n'umututsi ugihumeka nzabateranya barabanye abo baranywanye inyana n'imweru n'imico myinshi barayihuje ibyo ku rucunshu bibaye inziko ubwo mwana yinca babaye umwanda tubyina insinzi abacu bashize abandi igihugu bagihunze tubyina tuzi ko twibohoye kandi twiboshya kandoye Imana ubundi yabaga iwacu ubushitani yararutashye Mana data waremye umuntu waremye benshi waremye byinshi menye ujye unicuza aho wahombye mbarimo mbazi mbaru ubukeye nzaba ndurana nzaba mbarirwa amazina nkayagira inkomoko turi mu kaga kanagahinda uvuze yuko nyirinza apfuye si uwo mwishe si we gitera ubutumwa nk'ubu mu buhe bose abahanuzi nimuki twumva rwa bujindiri turamuzi mu buhanuzi bwa magayano uzaza ashaka kumara abantu rwa bujindiri rudahaga wariye imfubya dutera intimba ubu nta muturanyi twatabaza izina wubatse urya nka ngunda ko mbona ugundira n'iby'abantu b'imahanga ukamwita umwanzi bakwitaga inyangarwanda ubarushije iki kutabihakana ngo turahunahuna aho guhaha imitungo myinshi ubu yiswe iyawe impyisi mahoma impyisi nahetse ngo ni imitungo itagira beneyo impyisi mahoma irya ntihage impyisi mahoma irya ntihage imariye abana aho tutwatutsi narayihetse njye ndundarunda umuruho wanjye ukube zero ubupfura mu nda bwo buri hehe ibi bifu byanyu ko bitanahaga murya akaribwa n'akataribwa inda nini zanyu zimaze abantu ntimunakigira ku mateka yatubasa ubugome nk'ubu ndanababwira muryana inzara narababwiye ndabasubiye nimudasenyera hamwe ubundi nk'utu twatutsi ubutatu bwacu nibuduhuze duhashye umwanzi ukugana nyote umuha icyanyu utarinze kwitegereza izuru ibi byaje mwize kuronda amoko ubwo mwe pfundo niwo musingi wo kwigobotura ishyano nk'iri ko mvuga nk'ibyo mukandye inzara impyisi se nk'iyo muhetsi y'iki ko ari mahome isigaje mwebwe ubumba hano ubupfapfa bwanyu bumbaye umwanzi muzampiga mushege rero singe gitera singe watwaye Kizito mwumva mupende cyangwa se Rwigara ibi mbona nawe ni nabyo ureba inzozi ziteye uko usinzizi singe karosi singe uzi byinshi nge ndi umuhanzi w'umuhanuzi abasaza bubu nabo ni ntabo mpemuke ndamukubu ihawe ijambo ese abo mu rungano bo n'ibandi bo mu nyangire yahawe ijambo ubu mvuze nk'ibu ni njye mwanzi igihugu cyose gihanze amaso ingingo urugunzu niho nkomoko ugeze ku cyo mubugani wacu ingingimira ngira ni ntayo mvoma hafi sinishira babasare barimo ingona aba bana buzuye mu mihanda ibi byabo basigiwe na base birimo abandi ngabo z'umwama batazi koga baragatoye kuko aya mazi si yayandi babasare barimo ingona impyisi mu bana impyisi mu banjye impyisi nahetse impyisi mahuma